Welcome to Embodied Resistance. This is going to be a podcast exploring how dance movement therapy and harm reduction and embodied healing can support gender diverse youth that are impacted by school violence. I'm the host, Tori. I am a graduate student studying dance movement therapy and counseling. I'm just really passionate about creating spaces where movement can be a tool for resilience and self-expression and healing. So today I am honored to be joined by Dr. Rae Johnson, a somatic therapist, researcher, and educator whose work is centered around embodied social justice, queer embodiment, and the politics of trauma. So Dr. Johnson's research explores how systematic oppression is experienced in the body and how somatic practices can serve as a pathway to healing and liberation. They are an author of Embodied Social Justice, The Body and Social Justice, and Queer Embodiment, Monologues of Empowerment, and among other impactful works. So in this episode, we'll be diving into intersections of embodiment, trauma, and gender identity. This will be exploring how movement and somatic practices can support queer and gender diverse individuals in reclaiming agency over their bodies. We'll also talk about how school violence and systematic harm affect the somatic experience and what we as therapists, educators, and advocates can create in more inclusive and affirming spaces. So, Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation. To start, can you share a bit about your journey into somatics and social justice and what led you to this work?
I think it's easier sometimes to look backwards and identify the threads that we didn't quite see as present in our lives until we come to a place where we go, oh, I've kind of been doing this all along. For sure, there were some pivotal moments along the way, but I would say that growing up, although I never had language for it, not until, in the last decade or so. But growing up genderqueer, growing up highly sensitive with some sensory processing sensitivities and what Dr. Nick Walker calls neuroqueer. It was always for me a matter of finding strategies that would help me cope with an environment that I found overstimulating, but also not particularly nourishing. And for me, the body was always a source of connection, restoration, affirmation of who I was. And by the body, I don't mean how my body looked, because I think I was subjected to and experienced maybe more complexly than lots of folks, the really typical body norms and the real restrictions that we have around how bodies are supposed to look and gender roles and how, that all sort of maps out in a really heteronormative, ableist kind of way. So even though that was happening for me, along with everybody else, there was a way in which I could always reconnect to the felt sense of my body internally, particularly through music and dance. So that if I couldn't dance, I'd sit down and I would actually, I'm just noticing your earphones, your headphones on. It's like, yeah, that's what I would do. I would put on my headphones and plug in and go to another place. It wasn't a disembodied place. It was a place where my body was filled with music, where my body could actually experience a connection with something that was nourishing, that I had some control over because I could choose the music, right? And I really, without having any words for it or really being able to explain it to anybody else, I really felt as though music and movement were giving me a language that I understood better than English. Right?
Yeah.
So I've just been following those threads my whole life. And the more I learned, the more I became exposed to different facets of society. And I started to understand through feminist theory and queer theory the structures that were continually being reproduced through the ways that we interacted with one another. And I started to unpack some of what felt really hurtful and harmful to me and identify the sources, which were often, or I would say almost never, just the individual in front of me, but the whole system in place behind them.
Mhm.
The more I realized that it wasn't enough for me just to retreat to the pleasure and the sustenance of my own embodied experience, that I actually felt I needed to take this capacity that I was, I think, just born with. This has always felt like home to me. That I increasingly began to feel an obligation to talk about what I was learning and what I was seeing in terms of the ways that our somatic phobic culture harms all of us in different ways, but primarily and universally through an enforced disconnection between our bodies and our sense of identity,
Mm.
our sense of ourselves.
Mm.
And that there were ways that I was learning about how that disconnection, that profound, deep disconnection, was at the root of all of the ways in which I felt we were harming one another individually and and culturally and systemically. And I thought, if I really want to be in the world in the way that I want to be in the world, I'm going to have to work to change it a little bit first, rather than just retreating to my own world. So I was on a podcast the other week, and someone asked me a very similar question, and I said, I'm going to tell you a story about where this all started for me, and it's going to be a story that I make up as I go along, and it's going to be partially true. And the same is true today. I just
Mhm.
made that up. It's true, but it's a completely different story than the
Uh-huh.
story I told a couple of weeks ago. Just because I think that there's so much that I could say. There's so much that you could say, that any of us could say about how we got here and the role that our bodies have played in that
Mm.
journey. Yeah. But
Yeah.
that's a little bit of mine.
I love that. And you mentioned this like concept of your body as home. And I really resonate with that finding home. Like you always have your body and that is your home. This is your shell. This is you. And society and everything, there's always a separation between the body and the mind a lot in this world that we live in. And the society just keeps pushing that disconnection even more through just like time and everything. And I also resonated when you told me of the story of where you would put on your headphones and listen to music, get into your soul and everything, and just tap in. And I think that taps into the time of just the self care and the slowing down and just taking time with yourself, just yourself and everything. Because I used to do that all the time too. That's why I have these cool headphones. Yeah, I love it. And just also like tapping into your body, just moving it out, going with the music. But also, you talked about the body as a site of oppression and resistance. And this is how trauma can be stored in the body, how can be used to reclaim the body, and just also the impact of systemic violence on like queer and diverse bodies as well, and how that can be stored. And those other systemic like things being put on you because you are not cisgendered or you're not heteronormative, and just having to re-identify what you looks like in that like re-identifying, reframing, and finding home, and what home. Your interior decorations are not going to look the same as the home right next to you. You're going to might have gold frames instead of like silver frames inside. Just thinking about the body as home for me, when you said that, I loved that. Like just having that association. I have another question for you. In Embodied Social Justice and the Body in Social Justice, you talk about the body as both a site of oppression and resistance. How do you see this playing out for gender diverse individuals?
Yeah. Um, so to answer that question, I want to come back to this idea of the forcible and sometimes violently enforced disconnection from our own bodies. And I want to explain it in ways, and I want to give some examples so that listeners can appreciate that even though it's violent, it's sometimes incredibly unremarkable, and we don't think of it as violent. We don't, because we don't think of it in terms of the harm that it causes. But for example, being trained in schools to sit quietly at our desks for hours on end as small children. We don't think of that as systemically oppressive and violent, but I would argue that it is. I would argue that what it does is it disavows our natural impulses and inclinations to move. And in particular, for many of us, the need to move so that we can learn.
Mm-hmm.
So that we're being actively hobbled in the process of learning because we can't move our bodies in the experience of taking in and processing information. That for me, for example, you can see that my hands are moving and that my face moves a lot, and I look around and I dip my head and I turn around. I move a lot when I talk because I can't think when I don't move. And so that forced disconnection, that requirement that in order to survive, we must abandon our bodies in some way, is, and I'm not making an analogy. I'm not saying that this is a metaphor. I'm actually going to argue that this is a literal example of what happens in trauma. We tend to want to think about trauma as a single big event that significantly shatters or destroys or completely turns upside down our idea of what the future is and our belief in our capacity to survive into that future, right? That's one way to describe trauma. But I want to invite us to think about trauma as an ongoing chronic and developmental process that socializes us into a system that harms us in an ongoing way. And in fact, there've been studies that show that individuals who experience, for example, the chronic, insidious trauma of racism actually have stronger PTSD symptoms than those who experience a single incident acute trauma. Okay? So basically what I'm trying to say here is that oppression, I think, looks a lot different than we think it does. And it affects more of us than I think we recognize. And that oppression is traumatic. And one of the ways that we respond to trauma is by disconnection, by constriction, and by hypervigilance. Okay? So I want to take this all into how this is landing, how it can land on queer bodies on bodies that are not normative in terms of gender identity or gender expression. When the subtle or not so subtle messages that you receive from the world about your body is that there's something wrong with it, or you're inhabiting it in a way that makes people uncomfortable or upsets them or makes them angry. One of the things that can do is increase the likelihood that we abandon our homes in order to survive, or that we live in our homes, and by homes I mean bodies, right? That we live in our homes in a way that shuts a lot of it down so that our movement can become really constrained. It can get really small and close to the body. We don't move very much. We don't want to be expressive. And we certainly, I think, in many cases, don't want to give away our quote unquote deviance from gender norms by moving in a way that lets people see that our own sense of gender might be different from what they think it ought to be. I'll give you an example. I was at a conference, actually quite a number of years ago now, but not so long ago, that the issue of trans folk and gender affirming surgery and all of the rest of that conversation, it was really sort of at the beginning of a lot of that. And I had been invited to come and be part of a panel around gender at this conference. And I was trying to explain that the rules, that the social conventions around how we express gender in our bodies are remarkably strong. And people are like, And I said, like, for example, almost all of you in the room, despite the fact that my hair is short and my nails are short and I'm not wearing any jewelry or makeup, and I'm dressed in a way that's really androgynous, most of you are reading me as female, right? And for many of you, most of you, at least in terms, judging by the way you all are responding to me, most of you seem to be mostly okay with that, right? You might be being polite and hiding how you really feel about how I'm presenting my gender. I said, but let me give you an example of how our nonverbal communication and our body movements can transgress your idea of what's okay in a way that you might be surprised about. And so what I did was I said, okay, so for example, as somebody that you're reading as female, I'm not allowed to sit in my chair with my knees wide apart. And people are like going, like, what do you mean? I got up we were all behind, it was a panel, we were all behind this long table. And so I got up and I moved my chair out so that everyone in the audience could see me. And I sat in my chair with my knees wide apart and my feet flat on the floor and my hands resting on my knees. And I kind of kicked back in my chair and I took a breath and I sat the way any male identified body in that audience had every right to sit. And yet people were like, it crossed a boundary. That's what I mean when I say how strongly and how insidiously and how persistently our body movements are policed by each other and by ourselves. That we learn how to inhabit our bodies in a way that's not full, not completely authentic, not completely expressive, because we're trying to prevent the relational disruptions and the threat of violence that we believe will happen if we didn't do those things.
Yeah. I think you're talking about stereotyping of movements and everything, that how we identify certain movements as a specific gender. That's how in Spanish words are gendered. Like a table is feminine. Why is a table feminine? But I totally agree with you in this polarity too of hyper femininity and hyper masculinity. And I think that's coming out more now too in the world of, since people are pushing the boundaries of like what is these two gender binaries. I think people are pulling it apart as well as having that. But like if you step out of the, if you're assigned a birth into the masculine area, then you're supposed to present the masculine, and then it turns into hyper masculinity. Or if you, I've had going through the transitioning process of I'm I was born and assigned female, and now I'm transitioning to male. And people are assuming that I'm going to take on this hyper masculinity, and I'm just, that's not me. I can't do that. That's not who I am. And it's just having that shift, as you said, like when people look at you, they just, as soon as they see you, they just think that you're a female. Why is that? Why are we taking movements and thinking that they are? And then why are we afraid to do movements? Because of being at harm or at risk. Some of my friends don't want to go dancing at some places because they know that it puts them at risk if they want to dance the way that they want to. Really empowers that we need safe spaces as queer people and as queer youth as well, finding these spaces, because even like the queer spaces have been getting taken over by straight people because they have been safe spaces and they find themselves safe in those spaces, but now they're not safe because the straight people are there. It's just that thing. And then you also talk about in school systems where they don't allow kids move as much. I actually in undergrad started my undergrad as an elementary education major, and I quickly dropped that because I cannot force a kid to sit here for 8 hours to just keep learning, and I would be put at risk because if I want to take them out to recess as a reward or something, or if they just need to move and release their things. They're like kids. They're not supposed to be doing this. And what are we doing this for? Standardized testing? They're just making a bunch of money off of these kids. And it's just, we need to let them be able to move and express themselves freely. And I feel a lot in this world, we are quick to make kids mature and adult really quick, just making them this certain like cut and dry kid and making them grow up so fast, and they are out of touch of their body and they are getting overdiagnosed and over medicated, and it's just so sad to see. But you talk about also fear and shame and hypervigilance as well with these kids, and trying to be aware of how they are moving, how they are presenting. Yeah.
So I would argue that it's not an accident how we socialize children and how we discipline. And by discipline, I mean shaping through instruction and coercion and negative consequences of failure to comply, how we are shaping children's bodies through the education process is not an accident. It's not like, oh, we didn't think about this. We should maybe give kids a break and let them be kids. It's like, no, our education systems are built on the industrial world's need for workers, and workers do not move their bodies however they want. Workers need to be able to stand in an assembly line day after day for 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day and do the same repetitive motion for the entire time that they're working. That's what the education system was put in place to do, was to train workers to be able to use their bodies for repetitive industrialized tasks. And now, oddly enough, we're training children's bodies and we're doing it really well. I'm going to say something a little controversial here, so it might bother some folks, but I'd invite everyone listening just to think, I wonder how much of this I think is true, or I wonder how much of this might be true for me in my life. Because what I'm going to suggest is that putting computers, technology, phones, tablets in front of very early children is socializing them as workers for their next task in a technologically advanced society where most of us are going to have jobs in tech rather than jobs in a factory.
Mm.
And we need to be able to train our future workers to stare at a screen for 8 hours a day. And we're doing it really well. And we're starting them young. And the consequences of that socialization and that indoctrination of the body into focusing solely on a screen is going to have maybe even more profound effects on that disconnect between body and mind that we were talking about earlier.
Mm.
That we're increasingly, and we're training our children, but even as adults, we are increasingly disappearing into a virtual world in which our bodies are almost unnecessary.
Yeah.
I was watching a snippet of a news segment earlier today of a public school that had discovered that by giving the children virtual reality goggles, that they could take them on a field trip to a farm without having to leave the school. And they were so excited about it. They thought this was a wonderful development. And I was listening to it really in horror, going, oh my God, you think that this is an improvement? One teacher actually said, oh, we can go to the farm without actually going to the farm and getting all dirty. And what if it's raining? And it's like, wow. That's how we're training our kids to be disembodied. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
And we're celebrating it
Mm.
as an improvement rather than as the horror that I think it is.
Wow. Everything's just so easily accessible. Like one click away, you can be at the farm, or one click away, you can be at the zoo. That's crazy. Wow.
Yeah.
So disengaged on reality of like what it is and what it can be. What does the farm look like? Is it this picture perfect farm that doesn't actually exist?
It could be. Who could possibly tell? Because no one's ever actually been to the real farm, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It gets a
Wow.
little Matrix-like.
Wow. Wow. That's wild. Oh, yeah, that just like that just shows how disengaged we are from reality to our bodies, like that mind body. What does it feel like to get dirty? What does it feel like to be on a farm? Or like what does it feel like in these scenarios? I think also I was talking to one of my supervisors before. It just there's also video games of, let's say, Fortnite, where there's an instant you kill somebody and then you're dead and like all of a sudden you're revived again. Like there's no consequences either. There's there's so many bright sides of technology. What when you get into the real world, that's not how it is. Like it's not naturally like that way. So just out of touch of reality. Oh, I have another question. From a somatic perspective, how does school violence, systematic oppression, affect the way of gender diverse youth experience their bodies?
I think it depends. But I would say that a lot of what I was articulating previously about the ways in which bullying, peer pressure, and other forms of implicit or explicit violence in school settings. I think we just need to understand them as traumatic, and we need to recognize that queer identified youth are going to feel the impact of those traumatic experiences on a body level in some way or other. I think that from the research that I've done and the people that I've spoken with, the way that those experiences land depends on the person, that there's some variation there, but we're looking at the same things. We're looking at feeling even more disconnected from our bodies than before. We're looking at, particularly if the violence and the school bullying has been about shaming a particular way that a queer identified youth looks, that can lead to body shame, it can lead to body hatred. It can lead to being hyper vigilant or really hyper attentive to how our bodies look and move and how other people's bodies look and move. And conversely, it can also send people into their heads and into another world entirely where their bodies are things that just sort of carry their heads around. So there are lots of different strategies. There's that dissociative strategy, there's the constriction strategy, and then there's the hypervigilant strategy. I think the three of the most common ways that folks respond to threat, and to threat around all kinds of things, but the ways in which queer folks respond, I think, can sometimes be really affected by the fact that, and this is not completely unlike other people from socially subordinated and oppressed groups, but oftentimes queer kids are the only queer kid in the school that they know. Like, they're the only ones. They don't know any other queer kids. There's no other, it's not like they're going to school with members of their family and their family members are all queer, right? They're probably the only queer member in their family. And so they're alone at home, and they're often alone at school. If they're lucky and are in a big enough school, a progressive enough school and they've got the luck to have other queer folks, other queer kids in school with them in their grade, yay, that can make a huge difference. But I don't know that I don't think it's the norm. I think that's probably fairly uncommon for a lot of kids. So queer identified youth are dealing with isolation as well as threat.
Yeah. I think you touch upon the isolation a lot. I think there's a lot of pressure on youth to be this heteronormative and this cisnormative way because they have those parental caregiver pressure. They have this, they want to fit in with their peers. I remember being a kid and I was just like, I just want to be friends with everyone and everybody to like me. And then you have your school system, like your teacher, you have all these people pleasing. It's built into you, like these people pleasing adaptations in your body of just like wanting to force yourself to be like this person that everybody's going to like. And it's isolating so much. Even like if you do successfully put on this front for kids. Yeah, I remember so isolating. But yeah, just having community and having safe spaces. I think you mentioned like the community aspect is such a big role. And yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah. And then I have a question that leads after this. what does harm reduction look like in the context of somatics and trauma healing? How can movement-based practitioners incorporate it?
Harm reduction is not really my area of expertise. So let me answer the question in a slightly different way, using my own terms. I tend to think of the process of liberation and validation, including self-validation, and resistance and transformation as all part of a set of activities that are kind of interchangeable. And let me see if I can give you an example. I've worn my hair this short since I was 20. And that was the age where I finally got up enough courage and began to understand myself well enough to say to myself, and this is not how I think of myself anymore, but back then I remember thinking, I am a much cuter boy than I am a girl. And by cuter, I meant attractive, like to me, like I felt like, yeah, this is me. This is cute, right? And I never felt that way when I was trying to present in a way that was stereotypically female. For whatever reason, it never landed for me. So I got my hair cut. I got my hair cut really short. This is back in like 1978. This was back in the day when everyone had really long hair. And I cut my hair really short. And I remember walking home from the barbershop feeling just this incredible exhilaration. It's like, and I remember running my hand up the back of my head and just going, oh my God, this is so great. And I went home. I was living in sort of this cooperative housing situation. And my best friend at the time, she comes up to me, she says, oh my God. And the next thing she says is, can I feel? And she's running her hands all over my head. Everyone's coming over, they're feeling my head. Anyway, you can hear from the way that I'm describing that it was incredibly affirming and liberating, right? But it was also an act of defiance. It was also resistance. And so I think increasingly how I think about pushing back or resisting or fighting, gender oppression, those are all terms that see it as a conflictual process. And I'm not suggesting that there isn't conflict, but I think what I want to suggest is that being who we really are is a profound symbolic and literal statement of resistance and transgression. I think it's important that we're careful and we're thoughtful about how we do this, because the reason that we weren't already is because there was some danger and threat associated with it, right? So I don't ever advocate people just saying, oh, okay, well, I guess the way to solve this problem is just to be completely who I am all the time. There will be consequences. They're not just, that is, they're not ethical, moral consequences. They're unfair consequences, but they're consequences nonetheless. And my own path and my own preferences around being in the world is I would much rather see people building something that they love and being who they are and focusing on that than I am interested in destroying or dismantling systems. I think we destroy and dismantle systems by making them obsolete because we're all busy doing something else. So I hope that answers your question about, what kinds of strategies and how do I think about sort of how I didn't actually talk very much about how I thought dance movement therapy plays a role in that, except I will say something just briefly about it, which is I think most of us, whether we know it or not, have a way that we really deeply want to move in our bodies. And I think that dance movement therapy, when it's done well, rather than imposing an external set of norms around what a full range of motion looks like, or what, a highly differentiated set of movement qualities looks like, or, are you utilizing your full kinesphere, Sorry, little digs at dance movement therapy in there, but I've come to realize that a lot of the unfortunately oppressive social structures of the world that we live in have infiltrated dance movement therapy frameworks and can infiltrate those dance movement therapy frameworks so that we just actually impose a set of norms onto how people move without recognizing that that's what we're doing. I don't think most dance therapists do that. Most of the ones that I've worked with and trained with and trained when I was teaching in a dance movement therapy program, that wasn't typical, but it did every once in a while sneak in because that's how we're socialized. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is I think dance movement therapy can offer a safe enough forum for someone to explore what is that deeply personal, authentic movement impulse that wants to happen. And that's liberatory and transgressive and all in one.
I think you highlighted this perfectly and answered it wonderfully. You talked about choice and like agency and just meeting people where they are in the process, I think, as well is kind of what you incorporated with the dance movement therapy and that. And then you also, I'm just kind of associating this, I'm connecting the dots, how queerness, you talked about dance movement therapy and how there's this a certain like way of thinking about it. Western culture, dance movement therapy, sometimes that can like trickle into therapy in itself. But I think queerness really challenges what Western culture understanding of the body, of of like therapy, of healing, everything. I think just being queer just like challenges all of Western culture as it is and what we understand our bodies to be in those practices, since we see it such as a medical lens and everything has to be cut dry. Has to be like researched so much. And as we're seeing today now, the political world is like, even if you have enough research for the queer identifying people now, it's not going to be credited. That is now getting removed from the CDC websites, which is terrifying to see, but it just comes to show that how much we challenge Western culture is making the government scared of how much we challenge those things and those ideas and ideals.
Yeah, absolutely. The clear demarcation and polarization and rigid socialization into male and female is it's part of a larger political and philosophical system that also is responsible for the mind-body disconnect. So it makes sense to me that queer folks represent a seriously transgressive disruption to the way cis heteronormative folks want the world to look and how they want the world to run. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, just you talked about this as well, of how school systems are training kids and everything, getting rid of that normalized in schools and everything, that government wise, like they don't want to see that and like have that challenge in schools at a young age as well.
Exactly. No, if it gets supported at an early age, those adults will be even more entrenched and transgressive and unruly, right? Nobody wants that.
Yeah. Oh, you highlighted that so well. I have one last question for you.
Sure.
What advice would you give therapists, educators, and somatic practitioners who want to better support gender diverse individuals?
My first piece of advice is look at your own gender role socialization, regardless of how you identify. Start to unpack the ways in which you, as a dance movement therapist, have been socialized by the same system that now oppresses queer identified people and your queer identified client. I think it's critically important not just to undertake some professional development in the spirit of cultural competency to learn about those people. I think it's critically important that we actually begin to go, oh, those same systems of oppression actually affect me, and I've been shaped by them as well. And for example, what do oppressive, rigid gender norms do to me in my life that are restrictive and confusing or inauthentic or problematic? Like, really undertake a personal investigation. Do a searching moral inventory of the way gender norms, and in particular, heteronormative cisgender norms, land in the body of the therapist in their own lives. Because I think that that's the only way we can get to any kind of real kinesthetic empathy with our clients. Is that we need to cultivate a place inside ourselves, even though our life experiences may be very different. We need to be able to get to a place inside ourselves where we can witness, we can see, observe with analyzing, without judgment, but just deeply witness another human being and go, even though their experience is very different from mine and their struggle may be different from mine, there's a part of me in my body where I get that. And that's not going to happen unless you've actually undertaken the work to really understand and really get in your own body how these systems have shaped you too. So yeah, for me it starts with the body of the therapist.
That's so beautifully said. And I completely agree. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, there's all kinds of book learning around cultural competence, working with queer folks that, I mean, it probably behooves us all to do more of that and to do some of that reading and to take some workshops, but it's not a replacement for our own personal work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on us to be the activists and to do the work that for our clients to support them.
And to do the work for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? That I think there's something actually irresponsible about asking our clients to undertake a process of personal change that we ourselves have not undertaken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that I have to be the same as my clients or I have to have traveled the same path. It means that I need to understand, because I've really worked through it, how my body's affected by the issues that my clients are facing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's not like the blind leading in the blind. I agree. Mm-hmm.
And it's not me working with someone who's had a different experience than I have in a way that makes them implicitly other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Um, I'll tell you one more story before we wrap up. As an example of that, I worked as a dance therapist in an addiction treatment center, a residential addiction treatment center, for a couple of years, right back in the early days. Um, and I loved the work. And I love the clients. There was something just really bone deep honest about a lot of them that I really respected. But I have this emerging sort of ethical dilemma of, who am I to be working with people who are really in the throes of struggling with addiction when I myself have no experience of that? And then I realized that I smoked, and that I'd been smoking since I was 15. And I was almost 30 by this time. And I thought, oh, I can't continue to work at this job, which I love, unless and until I quit smoking. So I did. And I'm not suggesting that my experience of quitting smoking, although it was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life, I'm not suggesting that that is an equivalent to someone coming to terms with significant drug addiction, alcoholism. I'm not saying, oh, that makes us the same. I know your journey. I've been there too. I haven't been there. But do I know what it feels like to have that little voice in my head come up and tell me that one more won't hurt? Absolutely, I do. So it means that I've got some understanding of what pushed me to smoke, right? What pushed me to addiction as a way to self-medicate. And even though the reasons for the need for self-medication and the kind of medicine that people are using in this addiction treatment center that I was working in, I still understood the impulse in a way that I didn't before. And that's what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
That find, when you're working with someone that you think is different from you in some way, of course, honor and respect the difference because it's there, but also work to find how, as a fellow human being, you can find how a similar kind of experience lives in you
Mm-hmm.
and understand your struggle with those issues. That's all. Find the analogy in your own life
Mm-hmm.
and do that work.
Yeah. Find the understanding within yourself to understand somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Beautifully said. I love the story. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been a powerful and such an insightful conversation that we've had. Dr. Johnson, I truly appreciate you sharing your expertise on somatics, queer embodiment, and the ways system oppression impacts the body. Your work is so essential in helping understand how trauma movement and identity intersect. And I know our listeners will take so much away from this discussion as I have. Before I wrap up, are there any final thoughts or resources you'd like to share for those looking to deepen their understanding of embodied social justice and somatic healing?
Oh, there are now more resources out there than ever before. Um, Usually, what I do is I direct people to my website, because one of the things that I've done on my website is I've created a lot of links to articles that people can find for free. And so that might be a good place for people who are interested in these topics to start. And it's really easy. It's Rae Johnson, somatic.com.
Awesome. I'll also put it in the description as well,
Cool.
so they can just click that there. I've looked at it myself and it is very useful. So thank you for providing that resource and holding all of that. But thank you so much. For those listening, I highly encourage you to check out Dr. Johnson's books, Embodied Social Justice, The Body and the Social Justice, and Queer Embodiment, Monologues of Empowerment. I'll also include links in this episode notes for anyone interested in learning more about their work. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider sharing this episode with your community, leaving a review, or following the podcast to stay updated on future episodes. Embodied Resistance is all about exploring how movement, trauma recovery, and harm reduction can create safer spaces, especially for gender diverse youth impacted by school violence. Dr. Johnson, thank you again for your time and your wisdom. And everyone listening, thank you for being here. Until next time, take care, stay grounded, and keep moving towards healing.